Then thank you so much for joining us. My name is Bree Hogan. I'm the sales manager at Powell City of Books in Portland, Oregon. We're so excited to host Adrienne Raphel tonight in conversation with Bianca Bosker. You can check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. Tonight we're here for a conversation about thinking inside the box. You can support Adrienne and Powell's by purchasing a copy of Thinking Inside the Box. A link to purchase the book will be included in the chat, so please click on that chat button on the bottom of your screen to find that link. Tonight we start with a conversation between Adrienne and Bianca, followed by a Q&A session. So if you have a question for either author, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. In her new book, Thinking Inside the Box, Adventures with Crosswords and the Puzzling People Who Can't Live Without Them, Adrienne Raphel blends first-person reporting from the world of crosswords with a delightful telling of its rich literary history to dive into the secrets of this classic pastime and its aficionados. Adrienne Raphel has written for The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New York Republic, Slate, and Poetry, among other publications. Her debut poetry collection, What Was It For?, won the Rescue Press Black Box Poetry Prize. Born in southern New Jersey and raised in northern Vermont, she holds an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop and a PhD from Harvard. Joining Adrienne in conversation tonight is Bianca Bosker. Bianca is an award-winning journalist and the author of the New York Times bestseller, Cork Dork. She is the contributing writer at The Atlantic and has written for publications including The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, and The New Republic. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight. Welcome.
Thank you for having us. This is so exciting. Thank you. Well, I'm Bianca. Sorry to have just waved really excitedly, but I feel like I haven't gotten to discuss books with all of, with Adrienne, but also with all of you here. So this is very exciting. Yeah, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Powell's, for being you and, supporting writers and authors and readers and the world. I think it's an especially important time to be supporting our independent bookstores. And thank you all for supporting us by being here, but also hopefully supporting Powell's as well. And couldn't be more delighted to be here with Adrienne to discuss her incredible book, which was just such a pleasure. I feel like in the grand scheme of things, I'm sort of a neophyte cruciverbalist, but I did just say that word without stumbling over it, so I feel like I'm making big progress. And Adrienne is anything but that. And so Adrienne, maybe, I will pass it over to you for a moment.
Thanks. And Bianca, you can wave and be me anytime. That is like the greatest compliment to me. That's thank you again to Powell's, and really thank you, Bianca. It's like such a treat to get to discuss with you in this format and any format. I thought I would just like read for a couple minutes just from the intro to the book, just to kind of tee us up with where I was at starting this book, going into this process. And then I'm really excited to get a chance to talk with you about this book, because you've seen this book from when it was like before zygote. You've seen like this book in such early stages that it's fun. So you kind of know the whole process of it. It's fun to kind of think about it. But you haven't seen it quite as early as, I'll start from the introduction. You haven't seen it quite as early as I started writing it, because as I write in here, I started writing this book when I was 3. That's when I discovered what the alphabet could do. Using only a combination of these shapes on the page, I could beam down messages from my brain, which other people could put back together, making my message get wormed into their brains. Whenever I rode in the car, I'd play the alphabet game with my brother. We each had to find the letters of the alphabet in order, somewhere in the landscape zooming by, shouting out the letter and its sight upon sighting. Whoever got from A to Z fastest was the winner. Dairy Queen, Quiznos, and Jiffy Lube became shrines. When I was growing up, children's book author Roald Dahl's reader par excellence, Matilda, was my hero. I stared at the towel rack in the bathroom so hard my eyes blurred, willing myself to move something by shooting telekinetic beams from behind my eyeballs, the way Matilda used her mental power to pick up chalk. But I was even more excited about the other things that letters could do. How letters could arrange themselves into any words, and how certain combinations of letters suggested other ones, even when they seemed unrelated. Monday nights during high school, my family had crossword races. My father would make photocopies of the Monday New York Times puzzle, hand them out to us, and send us to separate corners of the house. At his shout, we'd flip them over and begin. I'd scramble to finish before hearing my brother crow, "Done." I'd scrawl the final capital letters and rush into the living room, where my mom would be coolly reading the rest of the day's art section, having breezed through the grid several minutes earlier. Dad would be pretending not to care anymore, a few scattered blank squares mocking him. As a senior in high school, I had to do a capstone research project that included a community service component. I did mine about crosswords. The centerpiece was a spiral-bound book of crosswords that I brought into a local 8th grade classroom, along with blank grids for the students to try their hand at puzzle making. My puzzles back then were objectively terrible. I didn't realize you should make the grids symmetrical or that all the letters should interlock with each other. So my puzzles looked like jack-o'-lanterns instead of neat quilts, clues/snaggletooth across the page. Thinking inside the box investigates the crossword from all sides. I start with the crossword's origins, tracking how that first crossword in 1913 evolved from novelty to craze to routine. I construct a puzzle from soup to nuts, and I go behind the scenes with crossword editors to discover how a crossword goes from rough draft to publication. I investigate the myths around crosswords. Are crosswords frivolous toys that fritter your brain away? Will crosswords stave off dementia? I go to crossword tournaments to learn from the best solvers and constructors in the business. I even take, RIP, a crossword-themed ocean crossing aboard the Queen Mary 2. The more the crossword changes, the more it stays the same. The crossword is a reflection of everything happening around it, but it's also an anchor. In the wake of a particularly harrowing presidential election, an editor at The New Yorker said he found himself turning to the crossword puzzle as a life raft of stability in a world that had gone topsy-turvy. It's no accident that the crossword grew up during World War I, and that the New York Times introduced its crossword during World War II. No matter how chaotic life is, solving a crossword puzzle gives you a sense of control. Seeing where the letters lead you sets the mind free.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you have written, about such a wide range of topics. I mean, you've written poetry, but you've also written about everything from reality TV shows to, I believe, bento boxes. And I remember when you told me that you were working on a book about crosswords, and I had no doubt that it would be fascinating, as it is, but I also, I was surprised. It was just interesting. Now, it's not every day that someone is writing a book about crossword puzzles. And so I guess I'm curious to know, what was the inspiration for you? Like, what possessed you to dive into this world?
It's, I know, I sort of surprised myself when I was like, I realized that I'm writing a book about crossword puzzles. Like, what? But it started as not a book. It started as an idea for a magazine piece. I had been sort of writing a bunch of magazine pieces and really getting excited about the possibilities of nonfiction and journalism. And I thought, I don't know, I was like, I like crosswords, I like word games. And I thought, what about a profile of Will Shortz, the New York Times crossword editor? And I was like, he seems like, I'd seen that documentary Wordplay that came out, like, that's about the like big crossword puzzle tournament, and it like kind of features Will Shortz. And I was like, well, but I haven't really read anything about him, and I thought you could do something interesting. because like, you know, this is where my mind goes. I'm like, oh, I could do something like really crazy and fun and make the form of the piece all like insane and kind of like a crossword puzzle. So I pitched it to a magazine and actually went up to edit and to interview Will Shortz, and he was really kind and like on spec let me just like come up and interview him for like half a day in his house in Pleasantville, New York, where he edits the Times crossword. And so I did this interview, and then I got like really into like the world of the crossword puzzle, like who are these constructors who are sending the crossword in to the Times, and like what is it like to construct, and like so the whole thing around it. So actually the article never ran because the editors said wisely, they were like, well, this is like it's not like, you know, it's like too much of two things. It's like either like you write like your profile of Will Shortz is interesting, but then you have all this other stuff about the history of the crossword that's also interesting. You have this two-pronged thing, and it seems like, you know, you're trying to do two things at once or too much of something. And I was like, there's too much for an article to hold. So that was how it started. But it did start with like, what would it be like to profile Will Shortz? And that blossomed into, wow, Will Shortz is he's definitely like the top of the iceberg, but he's the tip of this very, very big iceberg.
It's amazing. And what was it like to profile Will Shortz? I mean, he is, I think for people, I imagine a lot of people who are joining us are avid crossworders themselves, or cruciverbalists. I never know when to use the proper term, but, you know, tell us a little bit about like who he is, because I do think one thing that you explore that I do want to get to, and we will also open it up for questions, as we mentioned, so by all means, feel free to chat your questions to us. But, you know, you do talk about the, I want to get to Will Shortz, but maybe I guess we should back up and let's talk a little bit about the history of it, because I didn't know very much at all about the history of crosswords. And, you know, I'm curious to know, how have we seen them evolve, and how did we get to this point where Will Shortz is such a figure, such a tip of the iceberg, and sort of what does that mean?
Yeah, that was something that I didn't know anything about the history of the crossword. And I think once I started doing a little research into it, that was the other piece that really got me excited about this as a project that was going to be at least an extremely long magazine article, because I realized, oh, wow, the crossword has a very discrete history. The crossword puzzle in its current form was invented in 1913. By this guy named Arthur Wynne, who was an editor of a newspaper called the New York World, which was like a very, it was a popular newspaper that is defunct, but it was super popular in 1913, right? And he was like the fun and games editor of New York World, and he needed something to fill the fun section of the paper. And so he beautifully invented this like puzzle that blank grids were technologically easier, like they weren't super easy to print until fairly close to 1913. So he was using new technology, but also using like an old form of like word games and kind of word hunt and match a clue to an answer. So it's cool. It's like, it's a new invention, but it's borrowing on stuff that he's seen before. He's just, as any inventor does, he's stealing. But I thought that was so fascinating. And also 1913 is so interesting because like eve of World War I, it's the crossword comes of age exactly when modernist literature is coming about, right? So it's like this thing that is collecting high and low parts of culture all at the same time and throwing them literally into one space together. You could get, in that first crossword, there are really super hard clues, like the fiber of the gomuti palm. What is a gomuti? I don't know what a gomuti palm is. Like, nobody knows. And then like the answer is D-O-H, dough, which is great. I love it because like now we would just clue it as like what Homer says in The Simpsons, right?
Totally.
But it's like there's clues like that, and then there's clues like a bird, and you know, it's like, so the crossword was like from the get-go, it's this thing that's like both like super hard and super dumb at the same time. And I find a lot of that also going on modernist literature and modernist art, and so it's kind of both absorbing and reflecting culture too, and at the same time it's just a fun game. So I thought that that it grows up and becomes like a fad in the 20s. So I just thought like the sort of cultural history of it was something I knew nothing about. But luckily for me, happily for me, that the crossword turned 100 in 2013, which prompted like a little sort of mini industry of like people writing the history of the crossword. So like I got to borrow a lot of amazing research from, like, I got to build on that for my book. But yeah, that was so that was something that I just got so excited about when I realized that, yeah, the crossword has a birthday, and then it like explodes and has all these tangents across culture.
Well, I think you talk a bit about also, that there were, well, first of all, the crossword, being invented right on the eve of World War I, and, also sort of we turn to it sometimes in these times of anxiety or uncertainty. I have found that I have done that. And so I was not getting enough of my Saturday. I love the Sunday New York Times crossword. And I found recently that I was basically finishing it much too quickly. It was not lasting me through the week. And so I actually ordered a big compendium from Powell's, little product placement there, of 500 New York Times Sunday crossword puzzles. And to my dismay, I basically couldn't do any of them. And I basically then looked this up and found that a lot of these puzzles had come, I think, from like the 80s or 90s. And I was really struck by just how challenging they were. And I felt like I had really improved. I could, finally I was finishing the Sunday regularly, doing better, but these were just at another level. And I'm curious, I hope the answer is not just that I'm dumb, but like, what is going on here? Was like, when you talk about this evolution, what's changed, right? Like, has there been a shift? Are we constructing puzzles differently than we used to? I don't know. I don't know if anyone here has felt that experience who's listening, but I'm hoping that maybe you can diagnose me.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I would also love to hear if people in the chat have felt that too. But that's such a great question, because it, I think there's sort of two answers. At first, it dovetails with your earlier question of like, who is Will Shortz and why is he such a prominent figure in crossword history and now? And also it speaks to something that's still going on today, and like literally kind of today, I mean, not sort of August 21st, but like the past year, 2 years more than ever, which is how do we construct crosswords, and how are people constructing them, and who is constructing them, and where are they getting their ideas, and what goes into the puzzle from. So like, so the first, I'll just briefly, like the first answer, the kind of historical one of, in the 80s, the New York Times, as well as other puzzles in America, but the New York Times is sort of like the flagship American crossword puzzle. Its editor is, in the 80s, it's this guy named Eugene Maleska, who's like, he's really cool. He's like a Bronx superintendent who like got into crossword puzzle constructing. But Eugene Maleska kind of has this idea that crosswords need to be only drawn from, like, the answers can only be drawn from a very, very narrow, I'll just call it the like dead white male canon. And there's like in jokes in the New York Times crossword that you would only know had you been in some Yale history class in like the 1950s. It's like, wow. It's pretty bad. I mean, some of the crosswords, like they're very clever. He embeds all these like quotes from dead white men in there. Like they're interesting, clever crosswords. He has like good wordplay, but just the like cultural references and also the kinds of wordplay he's using, they're just kind of like stuck in there's a very particular audience that he's envisioning who does the crossword. And it probably is sort of true in a way, like the crosswords kind of like reflecting a very narrow bandwidth of culture. And Eugene Maleska, like he is, and this is borrowed from earlier editors too, but in the 80s, there are like really specific ideas and rules like, oh, you can't use product names. Like, for example, like Oreo is a super good crossword word, but Eugene Maleska's like, no, we can't clue that as a Nabisco cookie. We have to clue Oreo as, in the dictionary, it's something archaic, a mountain combining form is an Oreo, like the prefix for some kind of mountain. I don't know, whatever, you have to clue it as like a mountain rather than like the cream-filled cookies. So anyway, when Will Shortz takes over as editor of the New York Times crossword in '93, he's part of like a sort of new vanguard of crossword editors. It's not just Shortz, but it's a bunch of people who are saying like the crossword can do better, basically. Like the crossword can do better in all respects. It can reflect more parts of culture. It can be more interesting in its wordplay. It can have different kinds of visual appeal. It can just be a place. It's just sort of doing the same thing over and over. Why not take this game that we have? It can stay the same kind of game, but we can just make it broaden its horizons in kind of all ways. And so Will Shortz is really the person who does take the New York Times crossword and say, this can wake up, essentially. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so you're not dumb if you can't do these 80s crosswords. I can't do them either. They're literally are not quite the same game as today.
That's really interesting. I think on that note, you have in the chapter, it's called actually The Oreo War, Race, Gender, and the Puzzle. You write, the crossword is black and white, but it's very, very white. I'm just curious if you can sort of say more about that. Is that changing? Has it changed? Yeah.
It is changing. It's changing rapidly right now, which is very, very cool. But for a long time and into the present, the vast majority of people who submit crosswords to the New York Times, which is as good a barometer as any on like who's constructing crosswords, because the New York Times operates on a freelance model. Like if you want to have your puzzle published in the Times, me or you, Bianca, or like anybody out there, or anybody who like publishes thousands of puzzles in the Times, it's the same process. You send them all in and they get edited by Will Shortz, but he doesn't construct them. So the constructor sending them in, just statistically, like overwhelmingly white. I don't even know the percentage, but it's like overwhelmingly white and also overwhelmingly male. Like there was like, I don't know, it's like something way less than a third of constructors were or bylines were female, or but yeah, so like and yeah, so there was not a lot of diversity and it's not really the Times' fault so much. It's like there's just not a lot of diversity in people submitting crosswords, and it's a lot of cultural things, right? Like who gets encouraged to do crosswords. There's so much baked into it and now, I mean, the crossword community is kind of amazing, and like it's gotten really like there's a lively online presence. There's a great Twitter scene. There's been a lot of online tournaments during the pandemic that have had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people like join them, and the crossword people are like they're really aware like that, oh wait, this puzzle is not representative of the population, and what can we do about that? So there have been for example, there's an independent puzzle called The Incubator that only publishes puzzles by women who identifying as women. There's like a queer crosswords puzzle pack that's actively sort of recruits queer constructors. There's been lots and lots of like very real and very interesting sort of pushback against the Times for some of their policies. There's been like the New Yorker, like over half their constructors are women. They're doing a better job with diversity. So yeah, this is something that the crossword world is actually like a quite political one in a surprising way that I just really thought I was going into a topic that like, I was like, if I could pick an apolitical topic, like you think crosswords have nothing to do with the politics, and then they actually are quite enmeshed in it.
You, as part of your research, I know, went on a crossword themed cruise. You went to a crossword tournament. You tried your hand at constructing crosswords yourselves. I mean, what did surprise you about the crossword community?
That's one thing that surprised me was how diverse, in a great way. It's like I sort of went into this research with a stereotype of the kind of person who was going to be very good at crosswords or really invested in crosswords, like sort of a old retired folks who were like enjoyed it, and like there's that community, but the community is you see someone on the street, you have like you can't tell who's going to be the cruciverbalist in the bunch. I was really struck by how they are coming from everywhere, and also was really struck by how generous and genuine everybody I met at these tournaments, everybody I met on this crossword cruise, people, reached out to me to ask if I wanted help with construction, which was amazing. People were really showed me early drafts of puzzles they'd done. People were really very sort of open, and also really, really happy to bring other people into the community and help them and get excited about just talking all things crosswords, which is how generous and genuine this whole community was at this time.
It's amazing. I was curious, I just totally lost my train of thought. I had such a good question for you, but I know that everyone else is thinking of good questions as well. One thing that I found very, very interesting was just people's reliance on computers in constructing crosswords, which I have to say was maybe a little bit of a disappointment. Maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I was just very naive before, but I was surprised to see. I don't know where I sort of thought crosswords came from, but but it was very interesting to hear about the software that is available to people that kind of serves up different combinations and clues. For those of us who may have been naive, like I was, can you tell us about how that works? What software exists? Do people use it? Is it cheating? Is it not? What do you think?
Yeah, that also surprised me, and I was a little disappointed by it because I love the idea of sitting down at your desk with some huge swaths of graph paper and doing some sort of crazy mental math with the symmetry and stuff. There's computer programs out there that make it a lot easier to create a grid that's symmetrical. So in typical American grids, if you do something they have rotational symmetry. So if you make something happen in one corner of the puzzle, it's got to be symmetrical across the puzzle, right? So
that's a rule. That's a requirement.
Yeah, that's a requirement. And I keep saying American crosswords because, and I can talk about this in the Q&A maybe if people are into it, because in Britain, crosswords are just as popular as they are here, but they look a little different. The popular crossword is the cryptic crossword, which basically means that every clue is two things. It's both a straightforward clue and it has some crazy element of wordplay that you have to decode. So you have to do a mini puzzle to answer the clue first. That's in Britain. The grids look a little different. But in America, so that is a rule that grids have to be symmetrical, have rotational symmetry. So when you're constructing a grid, you just have to be very aware of that, because it's sort of creates a butterfly effect. So you can be really proud of yourself for doing something cool in the one corner of the grid, and then you're oh no, that's gonna mess up this other corner of the grid. And so I felt it really sort of drives home to And also, I mean, that's sort of a process thing. It's like the writing process of like, oh, you can be doing something over here and realize, wait, it's got ramifications down here. And then, oh my God, I didn't even think about it. And then I have to fix everything. So the software will help you with that by just like automatically like doing the symmetry for you. If you fill in a black square over here, it's going to put in a black square down there. What it can't do, I mean, and it can also like help you, people load in lists of words that are, and kind of generate like really good word lists, so that so the computer can fill in words that will work in the grid. But the computer can only, like, the computer's not going to think of like a crazy clever theme for you. Like, it's never going to get to do that. It's never going to, like, the computer's idea of what makes a functional grid. Yeah, a computer can like fill in a crossword grid, but that's kind of boring, and they're never going to make one that is as like exciting as like some of the best constructors in the business. Like, you know, if like Eric Agard can like fill in like these like really sort of fun phrases that like, so I think that and computers can't clue the words, right? They can't like make clues for your answers. So I was also disappointed that people use software, but on the other hand, software's upping the ante because it's not just enough that you like can complete a symmetrical grid. Like, that used to be like, that's really hard. That's an achievement. If a computer can do that, where can the crossword go next? Okay, you need to have like stacks of 15-letter clues. Like, how many like stacks of sort of 15-letter clues can you stack on top of each other and keep the words going? How can you make the crossword more interesting? Like, you can have crosswords where some of the clues, you can have like 2 letters. You could fill in, they call them like Schrodinger crosswords, or like quantum crosswords. So like one constructor, Ben Taussig, did this like male-female crossword where you could, some of the words, you could have the letter M or the letter F in that square. You could fill in either one, and it worked. A computer can't do that for you, but because a computer can kind of get the basics done, it just is like upping the ante for construction. So that kind of redeemed computers in my eyes.
Well, on that note, I did find it fascinating, the puzzles that you featured in the book that were just so insanely clever. I think, isn't there one that it was after the presidential election, and you know the story, you tell it because I'm going to butcher it, but I was just curious if you had any for yourself, any of the sort of like greatest of all times crosswords that you came across that for you were just sort of the peak of the pinnacle of what a crossword could be.
And it shows that like a crossword can be, it is an art form that can have a pinnacle, which I think is like something, that's like a basic thing that I didn't actually grasp until starting this process. So I was like, a crossword is a crossword is a crossword, but no, there are great crosswords. So the presidential one is like, yeah, that crossword is like one of the most famous crosswords ever. It's after the 96 election. So like the center of the crossword, it's like a 7-letter clue where you could either fill it, the clue is something like headlined in tomorrow's newspaper. And it's, or like name blank elected. And it could either be filled in as Bob Dole or as Clinton. And all of the like corresponding things, you know, it was either, you know, like it either worked as bat or cat down, whatever it was, you know, but like that everyone could sort of be flipped depending, and the clues were written in such a clever way, you know, if the bat or cat one is like mammal, so that could either be bat or a cat, right? So, but like, so it's this sort of, so it's this funny, like whether you filled in Bob Dole or Clinton, the entire puzzle worked. And that is like, that's such a genius idea, and that it could be executed is like, to me.
Yeah, that's incredible. It's just so impressive. So I'm about to turn it over to some of our questions here, but I did want to ask. You know, I find it so interesting that you, as a writer, would choose to immerse yourself in not just, you know, words, like when you write a book, obviously you're immersing yourself in words, but also a book about words, right? And all this sort of gymnastics that we can do with words and with language. And I was just curious, you know, for you, you know, when you go back and talk about the history, you know, crosswords were sort of suspect for a period of time. And you talk about this idea of maybe they are just, you know, I think asking sort of rhetorical question of whether they are just frivolous diversions. And I'm curious for you, like as a writer, how did crosswords make you think differently about language, about words, about writing? Yeah, it's just such a different way to interact with the written word.
Yeah, they did. And it,
or did they change your life in another way? Maybe it doesn't have anything to do with language. I don't know.
well, what was interesting to me was this like an early draft of the book in the research. An early draft of this book is my dissertation, and when I say early draft, I mean like that draft was like a like much more bloated, much longer version of this guy. But in that, I was and it actually was sort of a controversial dissertation within the English department because of this question that you're bringing up, which is like, on the one hand, like writing about words seems like so close to the bone and it's like so navel-gazing. But on the other hand, it's like I was in, you know, this English department for several years and thinking about, and like, where all you're doing is writing about literature. So, but like, are crosswords literature? Are crosswords an art form? What is the crossover between, in what way it feels like a riddle? Is a crossword like a poem? Like, is it a poem? Is it not a poem? Is it something more, less than, not even in the same kind of category as, or trying to do this sort of like taxonomic, like what thing, is it like the same species or just the same genus or order or none of the above? So those kind of questions to me, like so in my dissertation version, I went on sort of a long exploration of like close reading poems that were, to me, felt like crosswords and what they were trying to do with difficulty in language, and some that like were, but then went on a different direction. And I think basically like the process of sort of, I came to crosswords reading them through a lens of how are these things both connected to and separate from literature. I still don't really have a great answer to it, but I think there's something there, and they are like, it's like yes and no is my answer. Like, they use language, they play with language, but I was just like talking, I was just texting with someone about this the other day, saying that like, you know, crosswords make you think about like what kind of words fit into specific constraints or areas, but they teach you about, or how much do you learn about the content of what they're saying? It's a more particular kind of knowledge. So yeah, it's been so sort of the process of deep diving into like what's the relationship between crosswords and literature, and then a little bit of an untangling, wait, maybe that's not even the right question to be asking. It was a big process of going through the book. And I have a bunch of stuff about crosswords and literature in here. It didn't go away. Nabokov is a huge crossworder. A lot of writers are really fascinated with crosswords. I am really interested in that sort of interplay, and a lot of that comes out of the book. The only things that came out were like 50-page long close readings.
I just find it so interesting. I mean, I think I'm guilty of this, of like, you know, as also like as a writer, I spend all day, like all of my working hours, you know, thinking about words and what order to put them in. And as soon as I get up to take a break for lunch, I go to my crossword and I start thinking about words and what order to put them in. And it's just like, I'm sick. I don't know. Anyway, moving on, we have some great questions. I want to start with Nancy and Liz, who asked somewhat similar questions, which I think is a really good one, which was, sort of whether crosswords became popular in other regions of the world, and whether there are different versions of crosswords around the world that may allow for that would allow for different writing forms. So, you know, Russian, Mandarin, Thai, for example. Yeah, I'm curious to know this.
I love that question. And the short answer is yes. And I'm glad you brought up Russian, because Nabokov, so Vladimir Nabokov, is actually like the author. He's the first person that we know of to write crosswords in Russian. So he actually and he wrote little crosswords. I'll see if I can find it in here. He wrote oh yeah, this is really cool. He wrote a crossword like in the shape of a butterfly for his wife. And it's a crossword in Russian. And yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think thank you. Yeah, it's really beautiful. I forget what he calls it, but basically crosswords are very difficult to do if the language is not alphabetic. So like Mandarin or Cantonese or like Japanese or any language that more relies on syllables or characters, like there are word puzzles. There are sort of like word grid puzzles in those languages, but it's they just have to kind of look different from a crossword because you can't put every letter into a box. But that being said, like French crosswords, there's a pretty interesting French crossword scene that that's really hard, and because like French and Italian crosswords are popular, and because that language like more of the words use fewer of the letters, you can have grids that don't have as many blank spaces. So like basically like if your language sort of works a little differently depending on the frequency of how often letters get used in the alphabet, the grids can look a little bit different. And I know like India is a really popular crossword culture. You know, it is a thing that is probably like sort of far and away numerically like English language crosswords are done and published more. But that being said, like it's definitely a global phenomenon in lots of languages. And I don't know, maybe in a sequel or if I had more time, I wish I would love to explore the like international crossword scene.
We have another question from Lynn, thank you, asking about what is the general thinking on the efficacy of crosswords in keeping the mind sharp?
Oh yeah, this is something that I talk about this in my book, and I think it's something that what I love about it is the scientists just go back and forth on it. Like they love to talk about it. There's been studies, like there was a study with the Bronx Center for the Aging, maybe that's not quite the right term, but there's been studies that basically say, do crosswords keep your mind sharp? And one study will say, yes, they do. And then another study will say, no, they don't. And another study will say, we have no idea. So like it's so hard to know. It's the sort of chicken and egg thing. Like, do older people who do crosswords, like, does it actually stave off dementia, or like, is the fact that they're doing crosswords helping, or is that fact actually, they're already doing other activities that are good for their brain. And there have been like one study I love that kind of says like, crosswords might actually sort of kick the can of dementia farther down the road because they help you sharpen other neural pathways, but they're never going to actually like solve or like stop you from getting dementia. And there were studies that like people sort of put off memory loss for a while, or like they could basically like form sharper other pathways so they could sort of trick their brain into being able to think, oh no, I'm fine. But then when memory loss hit, it hit like precipitously. So, but so I found that study is really interesting. But basically, the jury's still out. But the one thing that everybody kind of agrees on is crosswords can't hurt.
Okay, that was going to be my follow-up question. That's good to know. Okay. It seems like a nice, quiet activity. We have another question. Are topical clues / answers an advantage or disadvantage to crosswords?
Depends on the crossword.
Can we define, maybe I just, like, how would you define a topical clue or answer? I'm sorry if this is obvious to everybody else.
No, and so that's a great, I see that. So topical, I mean, maybe I'm curious how people define it. I would define it as like something that, you know, relies on either in the clue or the answer or both, a thing that's like super popular right now in the zeitgeist, but will it be popular and really well known in 5-10 years? Who knows? Which
was, am I correct that you also talk about how there was sort of a regime shift at the New York Times on this question, right? There was kind of in those 80s and 90s years, this idea that maybe, you know, this should be a forever sort of clue. Is that right? That they were kind of avoiding topical clues for a time? Like, has the Times, which I use just as an example because it is so massive in its influence, but I mean, have they embraced more topical clues than they used to?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that like philosophically, yes. So like there is still this idea that like if the crossword lets you in, or it lets one in, or lets an idea in, like it's a big deal. And like people will, it's funny, like celebrities will tweet about this, like, I'm in the New York Times crossword, I've made it, I've arrived, you know. But it is a thing of like, they want their crosswords to be published in like the books that you were buying from Powell's, like this compendium of Sunday New York Times crosswords. They want the clues to not just be totally irrelevant a year or two later when nobody knows what XYZ is, right? On the other hand, like the crosswords definitely opened up to a lot more pop culture references. You know, it's gonna let in, you know, people like Issa Rae, the actress in Insecure, who's like, you know, maybe like 20, 30 years ago, they'd say, okay, you know, a TV show, a relatively recent sort of, like, is that well known enough? Is that like, you know, just going to have 2 seasons, 3 seasons and go away? But like, the New York Times says no, and actually we want to highlight lots of different cultures and different, so like there's definitely a push to try to include more cultures, and like, and the editors are really aware of this. Like there's some younger assistant editors who will say, Will Shortz, you have to include this, like, you know, be hip, like you can include like, yeah, a Taylor Swift song, like it's okay, she's gonna stick around for long enough, right? On the other hand, like so many people submit to the New York Times that there's such a huge backlog that they don't want to like accept a puzzle in March, know that they're not going to publish it until November, and then by November, if that theme that's like seems so cool in March is just so tired by November, that's not going to be great, because, you know, then you don't have anywhere to go. So the New York Times has that time lag problem. There are other puzzles, sort of independent puzzles, that are much more nimble and can kind of get around that, and are more interested in more topical puzzling. Like Brendan M. Quigley's constructor, who publishes like a weekly puzzle that is deliberately like, you know, this puzzle was like last week's news. Like we're definitely like, this is the puzzle for today. And if it's not relevant in a month, I don't care. I'm just going to publish a new one next month.
So just a couple of last quick questions, so we can squeeze them all in. One question is, are you aware of any crosswords that when solved would read as a poem?
Ooh, well, I think part of that is also like, what's your definition of a poems. So
Yeah.
I
Maybe every crossword. I don't know.
every crossword I used to at the sometimes in the bar in Iowa, a couple of like where I did my MFA, we sometimes brought Boggle to a bar and like did like, you know, played a Boggle board and then like took the words and like had to make flash poems out of them. So, you know, if like you can do that with like a Boggle word game, why not do that with a crossword? So like there is like a constructor, I think her name was Frances Hansen or something, who like she was this amazing crossword constructor back in the day who used to like make up her own little rhyming ditties and actually like stick them in the puzzle herself. So like that was like, she actually wrote these poems that like worked as clues, but then like when you solved the puzzle, there was like this little sort of rhyming ditty that came out in the center of the puzzle. So like there are, I think there's so much fun. So like there is that crossover. There are puzzles. Jacob Stuhlberg, who's was actually in the same graduate program I am. He's an amazing crossword constructor. He embedded an entire short William Carlos Williams poem into a puzzle. And like, so like, by the time you answered the puzzle, you had inadvertently read a William Carlos Williams poem.
It's amazing.
Yeah, that was very cool.
Why are two-letter answers generally not allowed?
That has to do with the symmetry. That was like actually just like a rule that so Margaret Farrer, who was like the first crossword editor at the New York Times, and she's sort of the grand lady of the crossword, and she set the rules that are now like the sort of standard what you can do in a crossword. She said no two-letter words. That was, I think, an aesthetic choice. It like actually looks prettier to have 3+ letter words, and now it's just like a thing that nobody even like. It would just be like, oh my God, what are you doing? Like, we cannot see that. Like, there are like very occasionally puzzles that deliberately break the rules and like have a little 2-letter word. It looks so weird if you've been looking at a lot of crosswords and then you see 2 letters, you're like, what? But yeah, I think it was actually like a visually aesthetic choice.
Interesting. Wow. More, I suppose, argument for crosswords as art, you know?
Exactly.
So yeah, I think, well, we had 2 last quick questions, but I know we're running short on time. Very quickly, there was a question about whether you looked into how many movies include scenes with people and crosswords. Like there's the movie Sandra Bullock, where she's an obsessive crossword creator, all about Steve.
Yeah.
Are there others?
Well, and once I started like learning about them, then you like sort of see crosswords everywhere. Like I was like procrastinating one night and like watching early episode of Sex and the City, and there's like this whole, so I talk about this in the book, there's this like episode where Sarah Jessica Parker compares Mr. Big to like a crossword, and like the whole metaphor of the episode is based on a crossword. In Brooklyn Nine-Nine they do crosswords. Like there's, the crossword does get used as a metaphor for a lot of things, for like a good detective, for a nerdy person, for someone who's a puzzling person who needs to be solved. You know, like, but yeah, the crossword does crop up in, it's like the centerpiece of this All About Steve movement. It crops up in a lot of places. Once you start noticing it, you'll see people doing the crossword in like weird lunch break spots in movies. Like it just sort of starts to happen.
And this is a question that you might know, but maybe someone from Powell's could also chime in on, which is whether there are topical crosswords as a type, in the sense of, say, a book of crosswords on literature or geography, which after picking up a copy of Adrienne's book, I'm sure if anyone has it, I'm sure Powell's has it, but do you know of any?
I'm sure you definitely ask Powell's about this. Yeah, there are, and yes, there are crosswords out there. If you like search at Powell's or on like bookshop.org, like you can find collections of crosswords. There are themed collections of crosswords. I'm sort of thinking, can't quite think of them right now. Oh yeah, no, a good example of this. I met a woman who writes the crosswords for like soap opera digest or like TV guide, soap opera stuff. And she was like, yeah, my concern with those crosswords is not that they be the most sort of like groundbreaking, constructing, whiz bang crossword. She's like, my concern is how many soap opera stars can I shove into this grid and still make like a crossword that works, which I think is fabulous. She was like, I made like 80% of the grid like filled with soap opera stars, but it was for this purpose. And also like, yeah, there are sort of specialty magazines. There's this guy named Miles Melnor, who I talked about in the book, who like his entire career has been, or a second career for him, but money making has been writing specialty crosswords for magazines like I don't know, Dog Fanciers or whatever, like Firefighters United, like, and he writes the crossword for these publications where he does the same thing where he's like, oh, I'll put in like all the dog names I can think of, and that's great.
That's amazing. Wonderful. Well, Adrienne, thank you so much. Thank you for, having us here and, writing this fascinating book. Thank you all for joining us. And thank you to Powell's for hosting us and for being Powell's, the amazing city of books, universe of books.